I've been coming to Wageningen for 27 years, but I'm an economist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm an interloper. So the fact that you want me up here, I find this quite an honor indeed. But more to the point, I think rural sociology at Wageningen has been home to two scholars of whom I have great admiration. The first one being Norman Long and the second one being Jan Douwe. Both of them are giants of rural sociology with a well-deserved reputation for intellectual innovation, rigorous arguments, groundbreaking critical scholarship. And of course, Han, Kees, Joost, Jessica, and others continue this tradition of excellence here in Wageningen. Over the course of its history, rural sociology at Wageningen has played a very significant role in a field in which I got my original training, and that's this field that was known in the 1970s as peasant studies. And many of the rural sociologists that have been working here in Wageningen, doing research here in Wageningen, have engaged with and been part of this field of peasant studies. So what I want to do is I want to talk about that past a little bit, but also then bring that story forward to where peasant studies has led us to, because I think rural sociology contemporarily, in its international dimensions here in Wageningen, very clearly fits into this new field that's been identified as critical agrarian studies. So peasant studies developed in the 1960s in the context of debates about the development of newly independent former colonies, and the fact that these societies were largely agrarian, which really begged a very important question. What was the role of small-scale farmers in processes of social change and economic transformation? But at the same time in the 1960s, this period was also one in which the American war in Vietnam shaped questions around the role of small-scale farmers in social change. There are several key moments in the 1960s that can be identified as being of extreme importance in the emergence of peasant studies. In 1966, Eric Wolf's very little book, Peasants, was published. That same year, Anton Chayanov's theory of peasant economy was published in English for the first time. In 1971, Theodore Chenin's edited book, Peasants and Peasant Societies, the first edition was published. In 1972, at the School of Orient and African Studies at the University of London, the Peasants Seminar was set up. And then in 1973, Terry Byers, Charles Kerwin, and Theodore Chenin established the Journal of Peasant Studies, where many scholars from rural sociology in Wageningen have published over the past half-century. Now, peasant studies was rooted in three very complementary but quite distinct epistemological approaches. The first were theories of agrarian change derived from the classical formulation of the so-called agrarian question, which really seeks to understand what is the place of peasants in the development of capitalist economies. The second approach was quantitative analysis of large data sets of farm-level production information, sets which featured in the analysis of the Organization and Production School in Moscow in the 1920s, the agrarian Marxists in Moscow in the 1920s, but also in the 1970s in the Indian mode of production debate. And then thirdly, there was this third dimension to peasant studies, finely grained ethnographic research, which featured in the intimately detailed work of a host of anthropologists who often took their impetus from the work of people such as Eric Wolf, Maurice Godelier, Jack Goody, and Sidney Mintz. To put it simply, but not simplistically, I hope, in peasant studies, agrarian political economy framed the central research questions, quantitative data sets provided the what, and ethnography provided the why. And cumulatively, powerful interdisciplinary explanations of social change in rural societies around the world were established in the peasant studies literature by luminaries and by new scholars from anthropology, from sociology, from history, from literature, from economics, and more. And over time, new questions emerged. I myself was able to attend the Peasant seminar in its later years and can confirm just how remarkably stimulating, creative, and engaging these seminars were. But in the 1980s and the 1990s, agrarian concerns in social theory went into retreat. We saw in a lack of global attention paid to agricultural development in terms of public policy. And when I worked at the ISS, well, started in the mid-1990s, we saw in our student enrollments, which in agriculture and rural development, as it was called in the mid-1990s, it was always a struggle to attract a sufficient number of students. But in the 2000s, I think, rural studies, rural sociology, in the developing countries in particular, has evolved and been re-energized. And this, I think, has been driven by two very important events. The first one, a real-world event, was the global food price crisis that erupted in 2008. Because this, of course, as we know, spawned a huge rush into the global study of what came to be called land grabbing. And from there, a broad range of analysis and investigation into contemporary development issues across Latin America, Asia, and Africa were undertaken. At the same time, in 2009, my former student, June Boris, was appointed as editor of the Journal of Peasant Studies, and he undertook a determined effort to open the journal up to a far greater plurality of voices than had been the case during the 1990s. Now, it was in 2009 that Boris led in the creation of something that he and others at the ISS called the Initiative in Critical Agrarian Studies. And this was an attempt to create a community of like-minded critical scholars, development practitioners, and, very importantly, movement activists who would come together from different parts of the world to work on agrarian issues, social change, and establishing the path forward. The initiative itself focuses on building linkages between scholars, practitioners, and activists, and promotes the co-production of knowledge. And I think that establishing this initiative and doing that at this point in time, especially given the nature of the simultaneous global crises that we're living through, is extraordinarily important. Boris's initiative in critical agrarian studies was not only to promote critical pluralism, but also open up peasant studies, what had been called peasant studies, to those well beyond the academy, particularly global social movements. And I think since that time, I have no doubt whatsoever that there's been a resurgence in research around the political economy of rural change in the global south. This resurgence of critical research is what is captured in this more contemporary phrase, critical agrarian studies. Now, Mark Edelman and Wendy Walford have argued that critical agrarian studies takes as its key point of departure the importance of analyzing agrarian social classes and the importance of the social, political, and economic forces that call these classes into existence or make them disappear, and that facilitate or impede the reproduction of these social classes when analyzing social change both in the countryside but also beyond the countryside. Edelman and Walford insist that there has to be a heterogeneity of views within the field of critical agrarian studies, and hence it has to be pluralistic, which I think is incredibly important. But they do identify three underlying analytical assumptions within the field. The first underlying assumption is that agrarian societies and urban societies mutually constitute each other, that the agrarian is not an other, but the urban and the agrarian are co-constituted. Secondly, understanding agrarian societies requires paying attention to the political and cultural economy of production, accumulation, distribution, consumption, and governance, as well as the very diverse relations and tensions within and between social groups. And then Edelman and Walford thirdly argue that understanding rural society in any given place and time requires a deep and profound understanding of the experiences and political culture of agrarian classes and agrarian communities, of generations of real men and real women, and of the urban groups and institutions that interact with and affect the countryside. So critical agrarian studies remains firmly rooted in one of the central themes of peasant studies, that is to say, the agrarian question. Whether, and if so how, capitalism is transforming rural societies in ways that are socially, economically, and ecologically detrimental to the lives and livelihoods of women and men, small-scale farmers, and rural workers. As an analytical framework, the agrarian question provides a threefold set of tools from which inferences can be drawn. The first tool is to study the agrarian process of production to uncover the extent to which it is or is not changing and understanding why it is changing, by paying particular attention to the distribution of productive assets and whether they're changing and why. Paying particular attention to technical change and who is benefiting from any technical change that is being witnessed. And paying particular attention to processes of labor commodification and the terms and conditions under which workers are entering into labor markets. The second investigative tool is to examine patterns of rural accumulation, because farm surpluses and deficits continue to be important drivers of social transformation or a lack of transformation. And so the impact upon patterns of accumulation within and beyond agriculture are strongly shaped by surpluses and deficits from farming. And then the third investigative tool is in agrarian political agency and what the impacts of that agency are seen to be. Because changes in production and changes in accumulation have implications for rural politics, because these are the very stuff of rural politics in many developing societies of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And of course, this rural politics spans a wide diversity of forms, from the everyday forms of resistance identified by James Scott as the weapons of the weak, to organized insurgencies that we still see in some parts of the world, from the covert to the overt, from the disorganized to the organized. So the agrarian question as the terrain of agrarian political economy can be encapsulated within 4 questions, which have been very nicely put together by Henry Bernstein. A question of ownership. Who owns what in rural society? How are resources distributed, controlled, and owned? Who does what? What are the patterns of work that are witnessed? Who is doing the productive work? Who is doing the reproductive work? What is the volume of the work? What is the purpose of that work? What is the motivation behind it? Who gets what? Where does the flow of the product from the farm, the income that's generated, or other forms of product, who gets it? What is the pattern of distribution? And those who do get it, what do they do with it? How is it used? Is it used to fund further investment in farming? Is it used to fund consumption? Is it used to cover deficits? To those 4 questions, I think it's important to add a 5th question, which my former colleague Ben White has pulled out, and that is, what do people do to each other? Because this expresses relations of power embedded within Bernstein's 4 questions. And these questions align with the changes in production, accumulation, and politics that I identified a few moments ago. But critical agrarian studies goes beyond these classical concerns of the agrarian question, I think, in 2 very specific ways. The first one is critical agrarian studies stresses the role of intersectionality in understanding rural change, or the lack of rural change. Intersectionality in terms of gender, in terms of generation, in terms of ability, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of other forms and markers of social identity, which can be sources of social division or social unity. The agrarian question intersects with these intersectional relations of gender, generation, ethnicity, and other social markers. Because, of course, farm production is gendered, rural accumulation is gendered, rural politics are gendered. The agrarian question is also an ecological question. As Jason Moore has so powerfully reminded us, rural capitalism does or does not emerge by working with and through nature, but nature shapes the terms and conditions by which it may or may not emerge. So the questions that we focus upon when thinking about the agrarian question are shaped not just by intersectional relations of gender, generation, and other markers of social identity, but also by ecology and the way in which these processes intersect and structure each other. The second way in which critical agrarian studies goes beyond the classical agrarian question is by placing rural change within the context of more global processes, which when I started out was simply not the case. And this is encapsulated in a concept called the food regime, which is the class-mediated macrostructural international relations of food production and consumption, which can be directly linked to forms of accumulation on a world scale. The contemporary food regime is the foundation upon which four sets of dynamic world historical processes can be identified here in the 21st century. The first is a global crisis of the peasant economy, witnessed in processes of de-agrarianization, the rise of precarious and feminized labor in the countryside, the increasing importance of waged labor in constructing rural livelihoods. The second dynamic process is global land concentration, which has been accelerating, particularly as land has become financialized around the world. Encapsulated in this idea of land grabbing, but going beyond it, because you have to really investigate agro-industrial capital to really get a better understanding of processes of land concentration. The third dynamic process that we see this century, which is quite unique, I just mentioned, financialization. The financialization of food and agriculture is something which is absolutely unique to the last 20 years. And then finally, something which many of us have been aware about for decades, but which really has come to the front of concerns, and that is the ways in which the biophysical foundations of agriculture are being undermined, both by agriculture, but by other processes that produce climate change. There is, in a very real sense, a contemporary global agrarian crisis that the 2008 food crisis highlighted, but that the war in Ukraine is now revealing, I think, to a much wider public who are starting to think about rising food prices, but also thinking about, come the autumn, will there be certain things on the shelves? It's this global agrarian crisis which frames the work of scholars, practitioners, and activists in the field of critical agrarian studies. Recovering the centrality of the agrarian in an increasingly urbanized world is of great importance, I think, intellectually, but I would also say it's very important to me personally, because more women and men live in rural societies today numerically than at any other time in human history, and they earn an all too often inadequate livelihood, at least in part, from participating in the growing of crops or the tending of livestock or the overseeing of forests. And when we look at the global epicenters of poverty and inequality, these global epicenters are rural. Yet globally, agrarian women and men are largely still forgotten in terms of public policy, in terms of state budgets, but also in the vast majority of scholarly research. It seems to me if we're to care about processes of poverty creation, human inequality, and the eradication of social injustice, we really need to devote more of our critical attention to agrarian societies. And that is precisely what rural sociology at Wageningen has done and continues to do. It's helping us to not only understand the agrarian and the non-agrarian world, but also lay the foundations by which a better world might, and I have to stress might, be built. So may I conclude by offering my congratulations to all of you on this, the 75th anniversary of rural sociology at Wageningen. May I also offer the hope that you do your work so well that many of you do yourself out of a job. Thanks very much.